When you hear the phrase, "a real man never complain," it isn't just about keeping your mouth shut when something goes wrong. It's about something deeper, something rooted in how you choose to position yourself in relation to life's struggles. You see, strength is not measured in the absence of pain or difficulty. It's measured in the way you respond to it. Anybody can complain. Anybody can point at circumstances and say, "This isn't fair. This shouldn't be happening to me." But the man who chooses to respond instead of react, the man who takes that pressure and channels it into movement, is the man who sets himself apart. Complaining is a reaction. It's instinctual, impulsive, and easy. It's the mind's way of releasing frustration without actually addressing the problem. But response, that's a different game. Response is controlled, deliberate, intentional, and that's where real strength comes in. Because, let's be honest, the world is not going to bend itself to your comfort. Life doesn't pause to accommodate your emotions. Storms will come, people will disappoint you, setbacks will slap you in the face when you least expect it. And in those moments, the instinct to complain will rise. But here's the thing: complaining doesn't change the storm. Complaining doesn't fix the betrayal. Complaining doesn't rebuild the loss. What does? Your response. Your ability to pause, to hold yourself steady, and to ask, "What now? What can I do in this moment to move forward?" That's strength. That's leadership over yourself. Think about it. When you complain, you put yourself in the position of a victim. You declare, without even realizing it, that life is bigger than you, that you are powerless, that you're at the mercy of everything outside of your control. But when you choose to respond, you shift the frame. You reclaim the authority to decide how this situation will shape you. That's why real men don't complain, not because they don't feel frustration, not because they're numb to disappointment, but because they understand that their reaction determines their reality. Psychologists will tell you that the human brain is wired to magnify what it focuses on. Complain about your problems and they grow in size and weight. Focus on solutions and the brain starts scanning for possibilities. It's literally a rewiring of perception. The man who complains digs his own pit deeper. The man who responds builds his own ladder out. And there's also a philosophical truth here. Life is suffering. That's not pessimism. That's reality. Every great thinker, from the Stoics to modern philosophers, has said the same thing in different words. Pain is inevitable. Struggle is unavoidable. But meaning is a choice. You decide whether the challenges you face will break you or make you. And complaining strips meaning away. It reduces your suffering to noise. Responding, on the other hand, gives meaning to your suffering. It transforms pain into progress. I want you to picture this. Two men face the same obstacle. One sits down, throws his hands in the air, and begins to talk about how unfair life is. The other takes a breath, accepts the situation for what it is, and starts asking different questions. How do I move forward? What can I learn here? How can this shape me into someone stronger? Now fast forward 5 years. Which man do you think has built a life worth living? Which man do you think commands respect from himself and from others? The difference isn't luck. The difference isn't resources. The difference is response. And I'll tell you something even deeper. The world doesn't admire the man who complains. People may sympathize for a moment, but sympathy fades. Respect, however, that stays, and respect is earned by the way you carry yourself in the face of difficulty. A real man knows that others are watching, not in the sense of judgment, but in the sense of inspiration. Your children, your family, your friends, they take cues from how you handle life. If you meet adversity with complaints, you're teaching them to do the same. But if you meet adversity with composure, with resilience, with action, you're planting seeds of strength that will outlive you. And here's the beautiful paradox. When you stop complaining, your pain doesn't disappear, but it becomes lighter. Because now you're carrying it with purpose. Complaints make the load heavier because they add resistance without progress. Response transforms the weight into a workout. It builds you. So the next time you feel that urge to complain, pause and remind yourself, this is an opportunity. This is the proving ground where you either rise or shrink. Don't waste the moment on noise. Channel it into action. Remember that real strength is not the absence of weakness, but the mastery of response. Because at the end of the day, way beneath them, nobody remembers the man who complained his way through life. They remember the man who stood tall, who endured, who responded with courage and carried himself with dignity. And if you want to know the true secret, it's this. Your response today is building the man you will be tomorrow. Complaints build nothing. Responses build everything. So when life comes for you, and it will, stand firm, breathe deep, and respond. That's the strength of a real man. When we talk about why a real man never complains, one of the most overlooked truths is this. Complaining weakens you. It doesn't just make you sound bitter or frustrated. It drains your energy, it fogs your focus, and it erodes your ability to act with clarity. Every complaint you give voice to is like pouring water into a cracked vessel. The more you pour, the more you lose. And at the end of the day, you're left empty, wondering why you feel powerless. Here's the simple fact. Energy is a currency. Every thought, every word, every action spends it. A man who constantly complains is broke before the day even begins, because he spends his energy on what he can't control instead of investing it in what he can. That's why complaints are so seductive. They feel like an outlet, but in reality, they're a leak. You think you're releasing pressure, but you're actually giving away your power. Psychologists talk about what's called attention residue. It means that when you focus on something negative, a part of your mind stays stuck there even after you move on. That's why people who complain all the time can't find clarity. They're dragging pieces of yesterday's frustration into today's opportunities. You can't build momentum like that. Complaining locks you in the past. It blinds you to solutions sitting right in front of you. And here's the irony. We often complain about the very things that we could fix if we shifted our energy. Think about it. A man complains about his health, but he spends more energy complaining than he does moving his body. A man complains about his work, but he invests more words into blame than effort into skill building. The complaint itself becomes a shield, protecting him from responsibility while secretly destroying him from within. Now contrast that with a man who understands that his energy is sacred. He doesn't waste it on empty words. He channels it, he directs it with precision like a blade. Instead of pouring his energy into complaints, he uses it to create solutions, to build discipline, to take action that actually moves him forward. That man doesn't just conserve energy, he multiplies it. Because when you act instead of complain, you start creating results. Results fuel confidence. Confidence fuels momentum. And momentum generates more energy than you started with. That's how progress compounds. Philosophically, it comes down to the difference between resistance and flow. Complaining is resistance. It's like standing in the middle of a river with your hands out, screaming at the water for being cold. You're exhausting yourself fighting what you can't change. But when you accept the river for what it is and choose to move with it, suddenly your energy is working with reality instead of against it. That's why complaining is so destructive. It's resistance with no reward. And here's something deeper. Complaining doesn't just rob you of energy, it robs others too. Have you ever noticed how being around someone who complains constantly feels heavy? Their energy seeps into the room, pulling everyone down. Words are contagious. Attitudes are contagious. When you complain, you're not just draining your own focus. You're draining the focus of everyone around you. A real man understands this. He knows that his presence should bring strength, not weakness. He refuses to poison the atmosphere with his frustrations. This is why leaders are remembered not for their complaints, but for their composure. History doesn't tell the story of the men who whined about the weight they carried. It tells the story of the men who shouldered it in silence and turned it into something greater. And that's not because they didn't feel the burden. It's because they refused to waste energy speaking against it. They used every ounce to move forward, and let me make this practical. The next time you're tempted to complain, ask yourself, is this complaint giving me power or taking it away? Is this complaint moving me closer to a solution or further into the problem? 9 times out of 10, you'll find the complaint is nothing but a drain. But if you can catch it, if you can redirect that energy into a small action, even the smallest step, you'll immediately feel the difference. Action restores energy, complaining drains it. That's the law. So imagine what your life would look like if you stopped leaking energy through complaints. Imagine the focus you would reclaim. Imagine the progress you could build if every word you spoke and every thought you entertained was aligned with forward movement instead of backward blame. That shift alone could change the trajectory of your life, because here's the truth: complaints are the language of the powerless. Action is the language of the powerful. One keeps you stuck, the other moves you forward, and a real man knows which language he speaks. So guard your energy. Stop giving it away to words that build nothing. Stop letting your focus be scattered by problems you could solve if you simply acted. Remember, complaints weaken you, but action strengthens you. Choose strength every time. If complaining weakens your focus and drains your energy, then what's the alternative? Responsibility. That's the mark of a real man. Responsibility is not just about paying bills or showing up to work. It's deeper. It's about ownership of your life, ownership of your choices, ownership of your outcomes. And here's the truth. The man who refuses to complain does so because he understands that responsibility belongs to him. He knows he cannot blame the world, cannot blame fate, cannot blame circumstance. The mirror is where accountability begins and ends. There's a simple but profound shift that happens the moment a man takes responsibility. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" he asks, "What can I do with this?" That's not a small difference. It's the difference between a victim and a leader, between someone who is pulled by life and someone who shapes it. Complaints are the language of blame. Responsibility is the language of power. Think about it. When you complain, you're pointing the finger outward. You're saying, "This situation exists because of someone else, something else, and I'm helpless in the middle of it." But when you take responsibility, you turn the finger back toward yourself. You say, "I may not control everything that happens, but I control my choices, my reactions, my direction. That's where freedom begins. Responsibility is freedom disguised as burden. Psychologically, this is what separates resilient people from broken ones. Studies on trauma survivors show the same pattern. Those who take responsibility for their healing, even if the trauma wasn't their fault, are the ones who rebuild their lives. The ones who stay trapped in blame, stay trapped in pain. Responsibility is the engine of resilience. Without it, life reduces you to circumstance. With it, life becomes raw material for growth. And philosophically, responsibility is what gives life meaning. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps, wrote that life ultimately demands responsibility from us. That even in the harshest conditions, where choice is stripped away, the one thing we always retain is the responsibility to choose our attitude. That's power, that's dignity, that's what keeps a man standing even when everything else has been taken. But responsibility isn't easy, it's heavy. It forces you to face your own shortcomings, your own laziness, your own excuses. That's why so many men avoid it. They'd rather complain than confront. Complaints are cheap. Responsibility costs you something. It costs you your pride. It costs you your comfort. It demands that you stop blaming the world and start building yourself. But here's the paradox. Once you accept that cost, you gain everything: respect, discipline, strength. All of it grows from responsibility. Think of it this way. A man who blames is a passenger in his own life. He sits back, watching through the window, waiting for someone else to drive him where he hopes to go. But a man who takes responsibility grabs the wheel. He may not control the road, he may not control the weather, but he controls the direction of the car. And over time, that makes all the difference. And responsibility isn't just personal, it's relational. The way you carry responsibility affects everyone around you, your family, your friends, your colleagues. They don't just hear your words, they feel your example. If you live in blame, they inherit blame. If you live in responsibility, they inherit strength. A real man doesn't just take responsibility for himself. He takes responsibility for the environment he creates. He understands that his actions ripple outward, shaping the atmosphere of his home, his community, even his legacy. Let me make this sharper. Every excuse you make, your children will learn to make. Every complaint you voice, your partner will begin to echo. But every responsibility you embrace becomes a seed that grows into discipline, respect, and courage in the lives of those watching you. That's why responsibility is not just personal development, it's leadership. So what does this look like in practice? It means when you fail, you don't point outward, you look inward. It means when you're tested, you don't say, "Why me?" but "What now?" It means when life hands you weight, you don't drop it and run. You carry it, you grow under it, you turn it into strength. That's what separates the real man from the perpetual complainer. Because here's the truth. Responsibility will either crush you or it will carve you into something greater. The difference is whether you resist it or embrace it. The men remembered in history, the men admired in silence by those around them, they're not the ones who had the easiest lives. They're the ones who carried the heaviest loads and refused to complain about the weight. They understood that responsibility isn't punishment, it's privilege. It's the privilege of growth, the privilege of leadership, the privilege of legacy. So when you face difficulty, don't waste your breath on complaints. Take a breath, stand taller, and accept responsibility. Not because it's easy, not because it feels good, but because it's the only path to power. At the end of the day, the measure of a real man is not how loudly he complains about his struggles, but how quietly and consistently he takes responsibility for them. That's where true strength is born. Greatness isn't born out of noise, it's born out of silence. The world tells us to speak louder, to make sure everyone hears our frustrations, to broadcast our struggles like badges of honor. But a real man knows that action speaks louder than complaint, and silence, when paired with relentless effort, speaks louder than empty words ever could. Complaining is easy because it's public. You can tell the world how unfair life is and receive a moment of sympathy. But sympathy fades, and in its place remains the cold truth. Words don't build, only actions do. The men who leave legacies are not the ones who wasted time describing how difficult the road was, but the ones who walked it step by step, silently enduring, silently pushing, silently creating. Think about it. The oak tree doesn't announce its growth every morning. It doesn't cry out about the storms or boast about its progress. It simply stands rooted deeply, rising higher with every season. That is greatness, quiet, steady, persistent. The loudness of complaint is temporary. The silence of discipline is eternal. Psychologically, there's something profound here. The brain is wired for reinforcement. Every time you complain, you reinforce the problem in your mind. You etch the pain deeper into your identity. But every time you choose silence and action, you reinforce strength. You tell yourself, I can carry this. I can keep moving. Over time, that creates resilience so strong that people look at you and wonder how you never break. But it's not that you never break. It's that you never wasted time broadcasting the cracks. You built through them. Philosophically, the Stoics understood this well. Marcus Aurelius wrote about bearing hardship quietly, not for the sake of appearances, but because dignity is found in restraint. Noise cheapens suffering. Action transforms it. Complaints weaken the soul, but silence hardens it. When you learn to act without announcing, to endure without demanding pity, you become immovable. And here's the irony: true strength doesn't need to declare itself. It's self-evident. You know this when you're in the presence of someone who has walked through fire. They don't talk about it endlessly. They carry themselves differently. Their silence says more than 1,000 words. Because they didn't waste energy complaining, they used every ounce to keep moving. That's why their presence is heavy with respect. Contrast that with the man who complains constantly. His words are loud, but his actions are weak. He talks about the weight he carries, but does little to move it. Over time, people stop listening. His voice becomes noise. A real man understands this, that the world doesn't admire the complainer, it admires the doer. And here's something important. Silence doesn't mean suppression. It doesn't mean bottling up your pain or pretending you're invincible. It means choosing where to put your energy. Instead of pouring it into endless words, you pour it into action, into persistence, into the slow grind of building something meaningful. Silence isn't avoidance, it's focus. When you look at the men who have shaped history, most of them weren't remembered for their complaints, but for their endurance. They didn't stand on stages describing every difficulty. They carried those difficulties in private and let the results speak for themselves. That's why their legacies last. Complaints fade with the air, actions carve into eternity, In a world obsessed with expression, choosing silence is rebellion. Choosing action over noise is the rarest form of discipline. Everyone wants to be heard, but very few want to do the work quietly. That's why greatness is so rare. It belongs to the man who understands that he doesn't need applause to validate him. He doesn't need sympathy to fuel him. His validation comes from knowing he moved forward when others stood still. Let's bring this closer to home. Ask yourself, how much time and energy have you wasted trying to be understood, trying to be pitied, trying to be seen in your struggle? And how much more progress would you have made if all that energy had been directed into action, into building, into carrying the weight instead of talking about it? That's the reflection a real man lives by, not who noticed my pain, but what did I do with it? And the beauty of this path is that when the results show, when the fruits of your discipline emerge, you don't need to explain. The life you've built becomes the proof. The silence of your grind becomes the sound of your success. That's why silence and action aren't just alternatives to complaining. They're the very foundation of greatness. So the next time life hands you difficulty, resist the urge to broadcast your pain. Don't waste your breath asking for sympathy. Don't give in to the temptation of complaint. Instead, hold your ground, direct your energy inward, and build. Let your silence be filled with action, and let your action be so consistent that it becomes impossible to ignore. Because in the end, a real man doesn't prove himself with words. He proves himself with silence that builds, with action that lasts, and with greatness that speaks long after he's gone.